Yeah, okay, so I'm very happy to have Caroline Koolhof back at Venture Cafe in the online edition. Welcome everyone to our Thursday gathering. Caroline is going to tell us about her new book called Introverted Leadership, a bit of the findings while writing that book, I think, and more just about the book in general. So please take it away, Caroline.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for being here with me today, talking about the book. I'm really curious to hear actually from you, before I tell you anything that I found, like what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear introverted leadership? What does that make you think of? Just like the first thing, can be anything that just, is there anyone who would like to comment on that? Please don't be shy.
I imagine someone who's very calm and collected. And then the first person that comes to mind is sort of like a Bill Gates type character for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see some comments in the chat as well. There's Paul who writes a shy leader. Juan, who says that you are a listener. And then Jacob, creating a safe environment. Yeah, it's interesting. See, I think the shy part, I'm going to get to that, because that's actually one of the misconceptions on introverted leadership. So stay here and I'll tell you more about that. So yeah, Introverted Leadership, that is my book, which I published this January. I first wrote it in Dutch, because I'm Dutch, obviously. And well, because I think that the message that's in it is actually quite international, I also wanted to publish it into English. So I translated it and then published it myself. The Dutch book was published by a Dutch editor, but then I decided to do this one myself. So what I want to talk about today, first of all, I want to explain to you a little bit how this book was developed. Like, how do you even come up with a topic like introverted leadership? Because let's face it, it's not like a day-to-day subject, right? It's something that some people say, like, how do you even combine introversion and leadership? Is that even possible? There are people who actually think that. So that's why I think it's a fascinating subject, actually. So I'll explain a little bit about how I got to that idea. And then in order to understand introverted leadership and introversion, I also want to explain to you a little bit about the research that I did for this book, what introversion actually is, and how it can be combined with leadership. What does that actually look like? What is an introverted leader? I'm going to show you that, like the main characteristics of that. Then next to that, I'm also a person who's pretty much interested in cultural differences. I speak quite a lot of languages, and I've always been interested in like what's the difference between different countries, different continents. So that was also something that I did research on for the book. Like, are there differences when it comes to introversion? If we look, for example, at Asia or America or Europe, are there differences? That is something that I've looked into and that I can share some insights about. And then, like my final plea, that's actually like the whole message of my book, is that introversion should be part of the whole discussion on diversity that we're currently having. Because introversion is partly inborn, so you cannot change it. So that's why I think that, like, next to looking at how many women do we have in a company or how many people from different backgrounds, we should also look at personality, because I think that can really bring something to the table in that discussion. So then, who am I? You might be wondering. Well, my name is Caroline Koolhof. I am the founder of Quiet Quality. Quiet Quality is my company that coaches introverted professionals in their choices, career choices, life choices, anything they might struggle with that is linked to work and introversion in general. I'm an introvert myself. I discovered that quite early on, actually. Already when I was in kindergarten, people kept on telling me like, oh yeah, she's pretty quiet. Like, why isn't she speaking much? Because I was just a reader. I loved to read. I was just in my room reading books or behind the computer playing games, that kind of stuff. And there were some people who considered that to be a bit strange. Not my parents, luckily, but some other people. And then somehow throughout my life, I started working as a journalist. That was like the first job that I had. And I kept on coming back, like people saying like, why don't you speak up more? Why aren't you more present? Why don't we hear that much from you? Whereas I always had the feeling that I was contributing. I'm a person that loves innovation. So I'm the kind of person that will dive deep into a subject and then I will analyze it. And then when I'm done analyzing, I will share it. And then that's like a bigger idea that I will bring to the table. That's my contribution. It's not like taking up all the space and talking about it all the time. So for me, that really was a struggle as an introvert in the beginning. And that's actually what sparked the whole thing to start looking into introversion and introverted leadership. And that's also what made me a writer in the end. As a kid, I always wanted to be a writer. I already wrote poems and like fictional stories. And I told everyone like, yeah, if I'm an adult and I'm going to be a writer, but I never knew what kind of topic I wanted to write about until this whole thing came together and I wrote this book. So now I'm officially a writer as well, next to a coach. Yeah, so how did I develop this book? Well, it's actually a pretty personal journey for me. What you see here, it's actually not far from the Venture Cafe location. This is the Algemeen Dagblad, which is like one of the biggest newspapers in the Netherlands. And I worked there for 3.5 years as an online editor. And this was one of those places where people kept on telling me like, yeah, you have to be more out there. You have to be more present. And well, if you hear that often enough, you start wondering like, okay, why do they keep on telling me that? Is there something wrong with me? Do I have to like change that? And how do I actually change that? So that was really something that made me wonder like, how can I get people to not say that anymore? Like, how can I show that I do contribute actually? Well, I'm a person that likes to take big steps. So in the end, I subscribed to an MBA program in Berlin. And this is one of the classes where we had a module in the US. My classmates, they were from all over the world. So I really loved that, given the fact that I'm really interested in cultural differences and different people. And so I had modules in Berlin, in the US, in Asia. And I thought, okay, maybe I might learn some tricks there on like how to be more present and how to like do what they expect from me. But instead of learning these kind of tricks, I actually learned way more about myself as a person. Like who am I and what is my personality and what suits my personality in my working life. So there was really something else that I had not expected to learn, but which in the end helped me way more. So doing all of that, I started looking into introversion and then introversion combined with leadership because an MBA program has a lot of focus on leadership. And I started to wonder like, how do other introverted leaders do that? How do they actually lead? How do they combine that fact of not being that out there with the leadership part? How do they do that? So that actually became my research topic for the thesis that I wrote for my MBA. So I started out with an online survey that I shared via social media, websites, emails, everything like online, fully online. This was already a little bit pre-COVID, but COVID definitely helped to share the whole thing. And I asked all those leaders about like, what are your experiences with introversion, introverted leadership? How do you describe introversion? Because people tend to have very, very different ways of describing introversion. And so I really gathered a lot of data from about 400 introverted leaders from all over the world, which was pretty interesting, like a lot of data that gave me a lot of insights. And I will be sharing some of those today. But then I'm also a person who likes to dive deeper. So I also spoke to 30 of them in person, 12 of them from the Netherlands and Belgium, and then 18 from all over the world to also have that perspective. And there's a difference in between the Dutch book and the English book, because in the Dutch book they're like mostly the Dutch and the Belgian leaders, whereas in the English version there's like people from all over the world. So that's a difference between those two. And then after that, I realized I had so much material, and having a background in journalism, I thought, well, it would be such a shame just to write a thesis and then that's that. I had already written 2 theses for my bachelor and my master's program, and those are somewhere in the drawer, and I don't do anything with that. I thought, no, it's just too interesting to not do more with that. So I wrote to a Dutch editor, told them about my idea, and well, they were interested in that. And well, from one thing that led to the other. And well, then in September 2019, I really started this journey of writing the book, writing the first chapters, interviewing people. So that was actually like a very personal journey that led to writing the book, which you see over here. I have it printed version here as well. It's really, really special to now have that printed, like a physical thing that you have created. I don't know if there are any creative people here, but I think you recognize the feeling. So then you might wonder as well, okay, so introverted leadership, interesting, but what actually is introversion? As I said, people have a lot of different definitions for introversion. Even introverts themselves, they don't agree on what it is. Researchers still don't agree on that. I've spoken to several of them and they all have their own definition. So I found that a pretty interesting topic. Like, why is that they all have like a different definition of introversion? So I started exploring all the material there is, and there's actually a lot. It all starts with this man, you might know him, Carl Gustaf Jung, who was actually the first psychologist who did research on that. He did that by doing all kinds of strange experiments. This is about 100 years ago, and for his age, it was pretty experimental. People thought, okay, that's interesting what this guy is doing. So he started observing people. He just sat in a room with people all day and then just watched what they were doing. Like, yeah, why do they do certain things? And is there a difference between people? Because he was really interested in personality and personal differences between people. And he found a difference between what he called introversion and extroversion. And he called introversion a subjective orientation on the outside world. That might sound a bit odd, but it comes down to introverts having a starting point within themselves. So it's actually their inner world that's the starting point. That is where they get their energy from, and that is where they return when they need new energy. Whereas extroverts, their starting point is external. They prefer to go out, meet a lot of people, because that is what gives them energy. So that is like the big difference that Jung found between those 2 groups of people. Well, if you don't know Jung, you might know those 2 ladies, American ladies, Myers and Briggs, a mother and a daughter, who really liked what Jung did, and they continued with that. And developed what we now know as MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Here you see that they also have introversion and extroversion, and they also found some different dimensions, like people that are sensing or more intuitive. Then there are people who are more thinkers, and then there are feelers, and then people who are perceivers or judgers. And that doesn't have to do with like judging like literally, but it's more like people who are very planned, and perceivers are people who are more spontaneous, who don't really follow a plan and just do what comes to mind. Well, so that's 4 by 4, which makes 16 different types of MBTI. So you can be anything combining those letters. For example, I'm an INTJ according to this one, so introvert, intuitive thinker, and very organized, so judging. So those are really like a lot of different types that describe people. So this is very well known still, and still pretty much used also in business schools. HR departments use it to like learn more about their employees, to talk about differences, but it's not really scientific. There are some people who call it like, yes, it's like a prediction, but not really scientifically valid. So science actually starts talking about introversion a bit later on, starting with Hans Eysenck, who's like a British German psychologist who did research on personality again. And he did that in a scientific way. So he took dictionaries and looked for words that describe people. And he found three main dimensions. One of them, introversion, extroversion. Then there's neuroticism, which is also like emotional stability. And psychoticism, like if you're prone to develop a psychosis or any other neural thing, which is actually pretty specific, but that is one main dimension that he found. Well, he's not that known, but other researchers built on that. A lot of American researchers, and they developed what we now call the Big Five. The Big Five are like the main personality dimensions of people that are actually scientifically proven. One of them, introversion or extroversion. They prefer to call it extroversion because it's a scale. So if you score very high, then you're more extroverted. And if you score a bit lower, then you're more introverted. So Big Five doesn't say you're one or the other, but it says you're a bit of this and a bit of that. And you can see on the scale how much of each component you have. So it brings more nuance. And it also has some subdimensions where you can see like, why am I introverted or extroverted? Is that because I prefer to do things on my own? Is that because I don't like big gatherings? All those kind of things, you can see that using the subdimensions. This is also one of the instruments that I prefer to use myself if I'm looking into personality of people, because it gives you really a lot of information of a person, like the personality. So next to introversion or extroversion, there's also agreeableness, neuroticism again, that I think already had, then conscientiousness, if you're planned or not, and openness, and mainly openness to new experiences. So those are considered like the five main dimensions. And I just saw the comment on shyness. And here's where I want to make a point about that, because actually shyness is part of neuroticism. It's one of the subdimensions. So it is not necessarily linked to introversion or extroversion. So being an introvert doesn't necessarily mean that you're shy. It's just another personality dimension. You can also be a shy extrovert. Imagine how hard that must be, because an extrovert wants to go out there, but if you're shy, like how are you going to do that? So that's also a challenge, I would say. Well, then lastly, and this is really, really recent research on the brain, neuroscience. And neuroscience found even a brain difference for introverts and extroverts. There's a certain area in front of your brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. That is where dopamine is processed. And actually for introverts, that part is smaller and they have less dopamine receptors because they are very sensitive to dopamine. They are very prone to get like high levels of dopamine and be overexcited by that. Whereas extroverts, they need a lot of dopamine input in order to feel happy, because dopamine is like the happiness hormone. You need that in order to feel all right. So introverts tend to like be overstimulated pretty easily by that. Whereas extroverts, they need a constant supply of that. And that is what explains why introverts tend to retreat from time to time if they have like too much stimulation. And extroverts, they prefer to be out there all the time because they need new supply of dopamine. So there's even a brain difference, which makes it like neurodiversity, right? Because it's a part of your brain. You're born like that. So that is like all the research so far. And then, as I said, I spoke to a lot of introverted leaders, and I was very curious to know how they actually thought about introversion and how they defined it, because I found so many different definitions and none of them were really created by introverts. So I just asked them, like, how would you define introversion? And well, they wrote a lot of different definitions. I put all of that together, did a text analysis of it, and looked at what words are they using, how do they tend to describe it, and then the words that they use the most, I used those to actually create a new definition, which is this one. An introvert is someone who recharges by being alone, but that doesn't mean that he or she doesn't want to be with other people. However, an introvert prefers smaller groups of people during social activities. That's because of the brain part. And he needs more time to express his thoughts and to analyze things than an extrovert does, because introverts prefer to look at things from different perspectives. So that's why. So that's the definition that I wanted to add to the current research, because I thought there was none that was created by introverts. So that's where I created one. So I'm curious to know, would you agree on this definition? Is that something you recognize as an introvert or maybe an extrovert?
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you recognize it?
I find this, yeah, I find it pretty correct.
And I really stayed away from like certain labels like shyness or not social. That's in fact why I added like the smaller groups of people, because introverts are interested in other people. It's just that they need to like have a different doses of it, because otherwise it's just too much. Then I see Hamdi, who is actually one of the interviewees. Welcome. He agrees 100% with this, so that's great to hear. Well, you were one of the people who actually helped to create it, right? So it's good.
Yes, Caroline, agreed. So 100%, and thank you for that. And I think it does reduce a bit of the stigma in the corporate world, particularly when it comes to shyness. Would not be the best way to put it to someone who's already maybe at some points in time would be suffering from getting told that you're quiet and not talkative enough. So that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, so there is actually a way to prove it, because of like this whole Big Five story. Like you can show them like, hey, it's another dimension, you know? You can be introverted and not shy at all. Or you can be extroverted and shy. So yeah, just to get that straight, I wanted to just share that information with you. So now let's combine that introversion with leadership, because leadership, that's like a whole different world, even bigger world, I would say, in the world of research. It's pretty elaborate. I had like, at some point, I had like a meter of printed research documents on leadership, just to tell you how much there is on this topic. So here too, I decided to choose one definition, because otherwise it's just too hard to work with that. And I chose this one by 3 American researchers, Hogan, Curfey, and Hogan, who describe it as persuasion, not dominance. And they also write that it only works if other people are willing to accept group goals as their own for a certain period of time. And I especially like this one because of the persuasion part and the not dominance part, because a lot of introverted leaders that I spoke to, they told me about the way they lead, and they tend to be really people's persons. You know, they like to be with other people. They like to give other people space. They don't want to be above them. They want to be next to them. So that is why I think this is a very suitable definition when it comes to leadership combined with introverted leadership. So then what characterizes introverted leadership? Well, I found a lot of different things, but I consider these to be the main things that I found. As I said, introverted leaders are very human-centered. They put other people above everything. Like, it's not about status or power. It's about other people, helping them, being there for them, motivating them. It's really all about people. And then also because introverts, well, they can focus very well on a certain topic for a long time. You can also call that deep work. And that helps them to really dive deep into certain topics. And that makes them pretty analytical. A lot of introverted leaders that I spoke to, they really became experts in their fields because they really, really researched something and then like mastered that. And sometimes that's even what makes them like leadership material, because other people think, wow, that person really knows a lot about that topic. So he can then share that with other people and help other people with that. So that's another thing that I found. So those are very positive things. And then one more negative thing I would say that I found is that there is a lot of affinity bias in the world of leadership towards introverts. And affinity bias is linked to the fact that as people, we tend to prefer to deal with other people that are just like us. Like if we go somewhere, we tend to really look for people that are pretty similar, like, hey, I'm a bit like you, and that connects us. And well, imagine that happens in a company. And like the top management, all of them are more extroverted. And you're an introvert and you have leadership ambition. Well, then it's very hard to actually emerge as a leader, because that extroverted top management has a certain idea of what leadership looks like, which then is a bit more extroverted. So they will not consider that introverted person leadership material. They will tell that person like, yeah, you have to be a bit more like this or like that, like just what they told me before. Because of this affinity bias, because they have the idea that the way they are is the way things should be. And that is also then linked to leadership. So that is what a lot of introverted leaders struggle with. Yeah, so the human-centered part, they also call that participative leadership. Or in Asia, they also talk about leading from behind. It's really, introverted leaders are all about people, don't like being on the foreground. They give other people a lot of space. So they are not the leaders that dominate. They just give space, sometimes even too much. That's like the other side, that they tend to give others so much space that they don't have enough themselves, so they don't feel heard or they don't feel seen. But that's really something very specific that I found that those introverted leaders do. Then, as I said, the analytical part, deep work, which gives them an expert status. And the affinity bias, which I found in almost 70%, as you can see here. Like 67.7% experiences like prejudices on this. So that's really, really a lot. And if there anyone who has experienced something like that, like at work, people who were telling you like, hey, you have to be like this or like that if you want to be a leader, or just if you're already a leader, did they tell you something like that? Is there anyone who wants to comment on that maybe?
I think I can. I have worked for a very big consultancy company before. Mm-hmm. And as you can imagine, most of the consultants that are running over there are very extroverts, being very outspoken, because otherwise you can't survive in the company. So I remember my first week when I was like trying to connect with other people there, which was already very hard. One of the senior managers spoke to me and he said to me, well, Cherry, I'm not sure you're fit to this company. I think that was one of the harshest comment I have heard. In the end, I worked the 6th year and I got my promotions. So I kind of reached my goal and was able to show people that you can be an introvert and can still succeed in such a competitive environment.
Yeah. So how did you manage to do that?
I do believe introverts has their own charming way, which might be a little bit different than other people which you would have around you, but you find the things that makes you a little bit different and in a good way, and you try to show that more often. It doesn't need to be like speaking very out loud in every meeting, because I'm usually the most quiet person ever. But you show it in a different way, in either in the way you deliver, or the list of suggestions that you give, or indeed, as you said, being a more deep dive into a certain topic, and then you become the most important person in that area. It's just a different way of approaching it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for sharing that. So it's a really nice example, and also I would say like the right example, because some people tend to like really adapt, but that is not something that you can keep on doing for a long time, because it costs you a lot of energy if you're not authentic. If I hear your story, you're being very authentic, just like showing your assets, right? So yeah, that's
exactly.
nice to hear. And it's also interesting that you mentioned consultancy, because that's another part of my book where I speak about cultural differences. And those are cultural differences, not just countries, but also company cultures. And that's why I called this chapter, It's the Way You Look at It, because really there is a difference in looking at introversion. If we look at different parts of the world, different companies, there are some differences that you can actually discover. To start with cultural differences, there's a lot of research on that as well. And the main things that I found in there is that Asia and Africa tend to be the most introverted continents, and Europe and North America are the most extroverted ones. That is, well, often linked to, I don't know if you know, the Hofstede dimensions, which talk about, well, different countries and differences between countries. And they link, for example, masculinity and individualism to extroversion. So, for example, North America is very masculine, which means people in America, they like sharing their success. They like talking about what they have achieved, all of that. That's like the masculine dimension of that. Whereas a feminine dimension is more about, let's do it together, we're a group, we have to take care of everyone. That's the difference there. And then there's individualism versus collectivism. Well, obviously, America is very individualistic. You just do things on your own, you work for your own success. Whereas, for example, in a lot of Asian and African countries, it's still pretty common to, well, strive for common goals, do things together. It's way more collective, hence more introverted. Those are linked together actually in the literature. And then there's also company culture. So there's consultancy, but also sales, journalism as well, where I've worked for quite a long time, which are considered more extroverted. They have like a more extroverted standard. People expect you to be more out there, outspoken. Which doesn't mean actually that if you're an extrovert, you're a better salesperson or a better consultant. I've also spoken to some people for my book, like interviewees who work in sales and consultancy, and they give pretty nice examples, just like you did, Jerry, just earlier on. Like, how did they do that? They have their own special assets. Like, one of them called it her special sauce, how she did things. Like, there were people in the sales company she worked for that asked for her because she really connected with people. She knew what was going on in their lives. She really, really asked them questions. She listened, and that helped her to be a really good salesperson, for example. But just that the standard is more extroverted. And then there's also the more introverted company cultures, for example, healthcare, education. It's mostly the cultures where people are at the center, I would say. So taking care of people. And then all of that, like my whole journey of finding out what introversion is, how other introverted leaders do that, hearing their stories, seeing what they've achieved, and also knowing that introversion is for a large part inborn, that really made me link it to neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is about diversity based on brain differences of people. And I think that introversion and personality in general should be part of this whole discussion on diversity and inclusion. Like, why are we just talking about the amount of women, the amount of people from different backgrounds? Why aren't we talking about different personalities and if that's balanced? Because let's face it, you can have all the women and all the people from different backgrounds that you want, but if they all have the same personality, how is that going to help you be innovative and like create new things? I think it's really a good thing to like strive for a workforce that is very diverse when it comes to personality. So that is really what I want to actually share with the world in my book. That's the main thing. And I think there's also a role for introverts in there to do that, because yeah, it can be difficult being an introverted leader, but there are also some assets. And I think it is really time for introverts and introverted leaders to be proud of that and to share that with the world, because we've been a bit quiet about that. And I think that's a shame. So I think for introvert, it's very important to know their qualities and their needs. So know what you're good at, know how you can contribute in the workplace, know what you need. Well, you do need a bit more alone time, for example, like big workplaces, like the open offices are not the ideal setting for introverts. It's really good to know that kind of things and really talk about that, because we don't tend to do that because we're just so used to like the extrovert standard, at least here in the Netherlands or Europe, that we don't even question that. But there are some things that you need as an introvert as well. So also just ask for that. And then also be aware of the culture that you work in, and not just the country, but also the company culture. So what is the standard? Is the standard more introverted, more extroverted? I think that's really something that you should have a discussion on with other people, because a lot of people, they don't even realize that there are those kind of differences. So make that something that you talk about. Because I really think that in the end, if you do that, if you do talk about that and you make people more conscious about that, then that will lead to more mutual understanding, because this whole bias thing, that just causes people to not understand each other, because they tend to project their own way of doing things, their own way of thinking on others. And those other people, well, they might not be like that. And then they don't understand why those people aren't like them. So that creates a lot of misunderstanding. So if you start talking about that, start sharing more about yourself, like how am I wired, then asking other people like how are you wired and how can we like work together using all of those assets. I think that really works for creating more mutual understanding between people. So that's really actually the main message of my book. And really curious to hear from you what you think about that. Do you think that diversity and inclusion should also talk about personality and introversion specifically? Someone who would like to comment on that?
Hi.
Hi.
I would like to get back. This is Muhammad Siam from Egypt.
Welcome.
I would like to get back to the point of being human-centric. Introverts leaders are being human-centric. How from your point of view, would lead the conflict between the targets and making profits, while the other leaders or the leadership in a corporate or a company are seeing that being the profits are their main target, not focusing, giving priority to profits and targets rather than people. and seeing the introvert leaders with who are human-centric are having a soft spot for people and cannot manage or handle the situations to get to these targets. How, from your point of view, would manage this conflict between these different styles?
Yeah.
I would say.
Well, I think that really is a difference between long-term and short-term, because really engaging with people, investing time in other people, that is something that you do for mostly a longer period of time in order to create a good connection with other people. And if you do that as a leader, then people will be more prone to work hard and help you reach the goals, help you reach the targets. Whereas, of course, you can pressurize them in the short term because you want result right now and you want them to like work harder and just put pressure on them. But in the end, that's going to break them, and they will not want to continue doing that because it's just too draining for them. So I think it's really a matter of, do you want to invest in the long term or the short term? And that is where I think the introverted leader comes in, because the introverted leader is way more long-term oriented, because he's really investing time in that. He's not in that much of a hurry as an extroverted leader who wants results right away, quickly. I think that is the main difference, if that answers your question.
It kind of does, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Someone else who would like to comment on that?
So may I comment something?
Yeah, sure.
So what I would like to mention, it's like, at least what I believe, as being an introvert, when interacting with extrovert, it could be a bit draining of energy in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, what I have learned throughout the time, it's like the fact that I have been investing more time to try to crack a problem, having an extrovert together with me and partnering with me may help me not to put that much effort, but it's like the story of, instead of 100%, 80% right.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be that we have already a very good idea, but we need the extrovert also to try to execute it faster.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a kind of, how we can really, as you were mentioning, like we need to know ourselves. So we need to see what our pitfalls are.
Mm-hmm.
When we are connecting with the extroverts, how we can take the best advantage of this relationship. Yeah. So this is something that I'm trying to put on the table. It's like, guys, I really need some time to try to crack it, because it's really not simple. If you do it a bit simple, someone else would have already cracked it. But on the other side, please come with me when I'm half done. Then somehow we can find the best way to execute.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow it has been working. Is it easy? No, it's not that easy. But at least I can share that from my experience. It has helping a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great example, actually. And but what I also like, and what I often advise people, is like, why not have like dual leadership? Like have an introvert and an extrovert work together, because they have different like priorities, different ways of doing things. And I think it's very complementary. I'm not saying that one of them is better. I'm just saying it's different. And if you combine it, I think you have the best of both worlds. Just as you explained, it really helps you to work together with an extrovert. And there is an introvert. Well, of course, there's affinity bias as well in the beginning, because you tend to project your own way of doing things onto the extrovert. You think like, why is that person so loud? Why are they taking up so much space? Like, why are they not a bit more like me, like more quiet and just reflective, you know? That's the flip side of it, actually.
Yeah.
It's an interesting observation that you have there. Yeah. Wait, I saw another comment in the chat. How do I get back to this? Yeah, there it is. Yes, this makes sense. Having an extroverted manager with understanding of people adds a huge value. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, so the main thing is that people are aware of this affinity bias and like the differences between people, and an introvert not being less, but just different, and how to make use of that, to really use their strengths. Any other observations from people attending the session today? Are there any extroverts in the room?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the concept of the level 5 leader from Jim Collins' book?
Yes.
From Good to Great.
Yeah, I mentioned him in my book. Yeah.
And what are the differences between your introverted leadership and his level 5 definition? Because I hear some overlap, but I have the feeling that there are also differences. So what are your thoughts on similarities and differences?
No, I actually think that a level 5 leader gets really close to what an introverted leader is, because it's a humble leader, really. And yeah, I think you could call a level 5 leader an introverted leader, and that's exactly why I mentioned that in the book as well. That's a good remark that you have there. So what do you consider the difference then? I'm curious to hear that.
It has been some time since I read Jim Collins' book, so I don't know exactly anymore the details of his definition.
Yeah, it's mainly a humble leader, working hard, not bragging about what they're doing. Just
and I remember that sometimes the company's ambition is more important than your personal ambition. So those are indeed things that I would associate with introversion.
Yeah. Exactly.
So yeah, it was interesting to hear what your thoughts were about the comparison between those.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, I think Jim Collins is on the spot there with his level 5 leader.
And then I have another question about whether introversion happens more in women than in men. And I'm asking that because I see on the cover of your book you have 2 images of women. So have you found in your research that the distribution, the split between how many introverts and how many extroverts is different between men and women?
It is an interesting question that I tend to get more often, indeed. But the funny thing is that it is normally distributed. If you look at like the normal distribution curve, I don't know if you remember that from high school, where we mostly learned that, at least in the Netherlands. So that is like a curve where the biggest part is in the middle. So a lot of people are ambivert, as we call them. They're a bit in between. They can be more introverted or extroverted depending on the situation. They can switch easily between that. And then on the other ends, there are the introverts and the extroverts. So that's about 30% each, I would say. So there are more ambiverts than real strong introverts or extroverts. As I said, it's a scale. It's not like a box where you fit in. You're just a certain part you're introverted, certain part you're extroverted. For example, I'm like 80% introverted, so I have 20% extroversion that I can use to do these kind of things. But then after that, I need to recharge, for example. And then the woman and men thing. Well, that's actually an interesting one because, well, it's personality, and personality doesn't really make a difference between men and women. It just occurs in both of them. But what I think might explain this is the fact that those characteristics tend to be considered more feminine, like listening, taking care of people, being human-centered. They tend to be linked with being a woman. So it might be that for women it is more accepted to be like that, and that then for men that's different, because men, they need to be strong and out there, you know. So I think that might be an explanation why, but I didn't really find that there's a difference between men and women when it comes to introversion. And then getting back to your question about the cover, well, actually, that's me on the cover. It's my husband who designed that. And I wanted to show like introversion as a strength. And I tend to wear red dresses, but not today, but often. So that's just like an image of me thinking, like the reflective person who then turns into some kind of superwoman because of the introverted power. So that doesn't mean like it's all women. It's just because it's such a personal story that I wanted to like make a little like connection with my own story, and that's why it was designed like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, and indeed another nice story about the cover of the book. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think I saw another comment on. Just can't seem to get the chat working here. No, I just stopped sharing anyway. You see the chat questions. There's another one. You mentioned individualistic cultures are more extroverted, but on the other hand, they like to be alone and more productive on their own. Any ideas? Yeah, so that like the being alone, doing things alone part, that is because of the way their brain works. But that doesn't mean that they're just doing things for themselves, because in the end, they are pretty much interested in other people, and they like to be with other people. It's just in a different way. They like to dive deeper. They really like to connect. So this might be like a contradiction, but I think they go together. You can be interested in other people, but then at some point you need some space for yourself to recharge, because that's the way your brain works. So that doesn't make you like antisocial, I would say. It's just different. And then a question from Daniel. What do you think the future of leadership will look like? More introverted, and to which degree? That's actually interesting. I was interviewed this morning by another Dutch magazine about like the future of leadership in this area of pandemic, working from home. And there is some really recent research that says that like the age of the dominant authoritative leader is over. Like the leader that tends to stand behind your back all the time, watch over your shoulder, like what are you doing, controlling. You cannot do that because people are working at home, and you have to give them space. You have to be empathetic, because some of them are struggling because they're working from home so much. So I think this age of working from home really asks for a different kind of leader, one that listens, one that's empathetic, one that gives space. And I think that does link to some of the characteristics that I just described from the introverted leaders. They do give a lot of space. They are very interested in other people, which they can then use to talk to people who might be struggling in this age of digitization. Then again, they also struggle with back-to-back Zoom meetings, which can be very, very draining for introverts. That really doesn't help, because it's still like overstimulation if they get that from 9 to 5, like back-to-back Zoom meetings. That's just not possible for introverts to do. So I think it has two sides, really. But yeah, I think that the time is right for introverted leaders to emerge a bit more and use those assets that they have, still really taking good care of themselves, not to get Zoom fatigue, I would say. Does that answer your question, Daniel? Okay, good. Maybe one last question?
Can I, Caroline?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Caroline, just would like to hear from you if you have seen any, let's say, well, real situation or even papers talking about career progression for introverts versus extroverts.
That really depends, again, on the company culture that they work in. One of the people I spoke to for my book, he is an introverted leader right now, but he did tell me that he feels that he had to work way harder than his colleagues in order to get to where he is right now, because he felt that people didn't see his qualities, that he had to prove himself, and still during meetings he's wondering, like, do I have to speak more? Do I have to, like, and this is an American, so that is really a culture where that is a thing. But yeah, I think in some countries and some companies that really is harder for introverts. Whereas if you compare that to like the more Asian cultures where it is more accepted to be introverted, that it might be easier to actually emerge as a leader. So it really depends on what the standard is and what is expected of you. So I don't know how you experience that. Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah. So I had one colleague from marketing, and usually in marketing we have this preconcept that people should be more extrovert and so on. And when I was comparing him with others, I could definitely see that he was not flying as high as others. Of course, I was just trying to look to this introvert-extrovert perspective.
Yeah.
I'm part of R&D. Somehow, it's also expected that people would go a little bit deeper to try to solve problems and bring solutions and so on. But even though what I see is like the extroverts, because they are somehow a little bit more prone towards the political side, and they are able somehow to manage a little bit such type of circumstances, that they are flying higher. So this is actually but it could be very biased. So this is why I was bringing this question to you, just to have a more holistic overview of the situation.
Yeah, so it really depends on the situation, but it happens a lot, like the way you describe it. Yes, exactly. So, yeah, so I do hope, you're welcome. I do hope that my book will make people reflect on that a little bit more. If you want to read it, you can buy it on Amazon, or if you want a signed copy, I have some copies here in the Netherlands at home because Amazon ships it from the US, so that takes a while. If you want a signed copy, just contact me and then I can help you with that. No problem. So thank you very much for attending the session today. It's really great that so many people attended because I think it's really an important topic. Don't hesitate to connect with me. You can easily find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, all of that. Just drop me a line because I always like to hear from people who attended these kind of webinars, like, how did you experience it? Like, did you learn anything? Any other questions? Feel free to contact me because I know that introverts tend to first like digest all of this and maybe have a question tomorrow or even like next week. Don't hesitate to contact me. Always welcome. I love discussing this topic. So thank you.
Thank you, Caroline.